Chapter 1 Smoke over Tondo. The morning heat rose early in Tondo. It always did. Even before the sun climbed over the broken rooftops and rusted sheets of corrugated metal, the air already carried the suffocating breath of the city diesel smoke, frying oil, sewage, and the sour rot of garbage that never seemed to quite disappear. From the narrow, maze-like alleys, gray smoke drifted upward from small charcoal fires where families boiled water and cooked whatever meager scraps of food they could find. The streets, paved with cracked concrete and slick with dark mud, were barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Above them, tangled electrical wires hung precariously low, swaying like black vines waiting to catch out the unwary. Children, their faces smudged with soot and dirt, ran barefoot over the jagged terrain, weaving expertly between stray dogs sniffing for scraps and wooden pushcarts piled high with scavenged plastic. Here, life moved in tight spaces. There was no privacy, no quiet, and no pause. Neighbors knew every argument, every debt, and every illness that plagued the families next door, separated only by thin walls of plywood and tarp. And above all, survival had its own distinct smell. At the edge of the neighborhood stood the dumpsite, a monstrous, sprawling mountain of trash that seemed to grow larger and more imposing every single day. From a distance, it looked almost alive, shifting and settling under its own weight. Multicolored plastic bags fluttered like ragged flags in the hot breeze. Rusted tin cans, mounds of spoiled meat, shattered appliances, used diapers, and piles of rotting fruit formed a jagged landscape that openly steamed in the blistering tropical heat. Industrial dump trucks arrived in an endless, rhythmic procession, their tires crushing deep grooves into the mud. They threw themselves into reverse with loud, echoing beeping sounds, tilting their steel beds to unload fresh, towering piles of Manila's discarded life. For most of the sprawling metropolis, the people living in the high-rise condos and working in the air-conditioned towers of Makati and the fort, this place was just a distant nightmare. It was just garbage. An afterthought. But for the people of Tondo, it was a lifeline. It was a chaotic, desperate marketplace. And a boy named Mateo Reyes knew every jagged corner of it. Mateo was 13 the first time he climbed the trash mountain alone. Before that, his father had always led the way, showing him which piles were stable and which would collapse into sinkholes of rotting sludge. But his father had died of a sudden, violent cough a year ago, leaving Mateo as the primary provider for himself and his mother. Now, his bare feet calloused into thick, unfeeling leather by years of walking without shoes moved carefully over shards of broken glass, jagged tin, and twisted rusted metal. The smell near the top of the pile was thick enough to taste, leaving a metallic, acidic film coating the back of his throat. Sweat ran down his temples and stung his eyes as the morning sun burned hotter, baking the decay. But Mateo ignored all of it. He stepped cleanly over a coil of rusted wire that had slashed another boy's ankle just days prior. He had grown used to the oppressive stench a long time ago. Everyone here had. You either grew numb to it, or you starved. Below him, dozens of people picked through the garbage like ants on a carcass, armed with wire hooks, wooden sticks, and bare, hardened hands. Some focused solely on searching for plastic bottles and flattened cardboard, stuffing them into burlap sacks to sell to the recycling way stations for a few meager coins. Others hunted for copper wire or heavy scrap metal. But a few dug much deeper, plunging their hands into the wet, dark core of the mounds. Looking for food. Mateo carried a heavy, bent piece of iron rebar he had scavenged weeks earlier. One end was hooked perfectly. It worked flawlessly for stabbing into compacted trash and pulling apart heavy plastic garbage bags without having to touch the worst, most dangerous parts with his bare hands. He stood still at the crest of the hill, his dark eyes scanning a freshly unloaded pile dumped by a green truck only minutes before. That was the trick of the trade. The unspoken rule. Fresh trash meant fresh chances, before the rats, the flies, and the baking sun ruined whatever was inside. He moved quickly, sliding down the slope, and stabbed the rebar into an oversized black garbage bag, ripping it wide open. A swarm of flies erupted into the air. Greasy fast food cartons spilled out onto the dirt. Clumps of half-eaten, coagulated rice. Greasy chicken bones. And a soggy, yellow-stained paper box. Mateo crouched low, his heart beating a little faster. He pushed the cartons aside and opened the soggy box. Inside were 4 pieces of fried chicken. 2 of them were largely untouched, still wrapped in greasy white paper, discarded by someone in the city whose eyes were bigger than their stomach. Mateo quickly brushed off the worst of the dirt, picking off a stray piece of grit, and carefully placed the meat into the clear plastic bag hanging securely from his thin wrist. That was pag. Food rescued directly from the trash. Food cleaned, boiled, and fried again to mask the rot. Food that kept desperate families alive for one more agonizing day. He found a few more pieces over the next hour, 2 chunks of pork scraps, a fist-sized clump of clean-looking rice, and a miraculous sealed soda bottle someone had thrown away after taking only a few sips. It wasn't a bad haul. Not great either. But it was enough. From the bottom of the trash hill, a sharp, recognizable voice shouted over the drone of the dump trucks. Mateo. He froze, his shoulders tensing, before turning around slowly. 3 boys stood near a stack of burning tires at the base of the mound, staring up at him. They were older, maybe 16 or 17, dressed in oversized, oil-stained t-shirts and ripped denim. But it was the faded red bandanas tied loosely around their biceps that marked them. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who they were. The Askals. They were just one of the many small, vicious street crews that carved out territories in the depths of Tondo. In the grand scheme of Manila's criminal underworld, they weren't the biggest gang. Not even close. But down here, in these suffocating alleys where the police almost never ventured, they were the authority. They made the rules, and they enforced them with heavy fists and concealed knives. Mateo climbed down the shifting trash slope slowly, taking care not to trip. Running would only make them chase him, and no one outran the Askals in their own territory. The tallest boy, June, stepped forward. June was lean and wiry, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He cracked a knowing grin as Mateo approached. "You find something good up there today, little man?" June asked, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. Mateo clamped his jaw shut and lifted his plastic bag slightly, showing the contents without offering them. "Just some chicken." June laughed, looking back at his 2 friends. "Look at this guy. Chicken. He's eating like a damn king tonight." The other boys snickered, nudging each other. One of them chewed lazily on a piece of sugarcane, his eyes locked on Mateo's worn-out shirt. Mateo didn't react. He kept his face blank. Over the past year, he had learned the hard way that showing anger, fear, or defiance only made things infinitely worse. Pride was an expensive luxury that boys like him couldn't afford. June stepped closer, invading Mateo's space. The smell of cheap liquor and stale cigarette smoke rolled off him. June was a few years older, a runaway from a broken home in Navotas who had learned early that the only way to survive the slums was to be the one taking, not the one giving. His deepest fear wasn't starvation anymore, it was being weak enough to be ignored again. "You know the rule, right? Unloading day means a fee for the privilege of hunting on our mountain." Mateo let out a quiet sigh. He didn't argue. He just opened the top of the plastic bag and held it out. June reached inside with unwashed hands and callously pulled out the 2 biggest, meatiest pieces of chicken Mateo had just found. He inspected them for a second, then tossed them casually into his own plastic sack. "Tax," June said, his smile fading into something colder. "Be glad we let you keep the rest." The boys turned and walked away, their laughter echoing off the corrugated metal fences. Mateo stood still, his hands forming tight fists at his sides as he watched them disappear into the shadowy alley. It made his blood boil. It wasn't fair. He had done the back-breaking work. He had braved the glass, the wire, and the heat. But he released his fists, taking a deep breath of the foul air. Fairness had nothing to do with life here. He tied his bag tightly and headed home. Home was a dark, single-room shack pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle from scavenged plywood, rusted tin sheets, and faded blue scraps of tarpaulin. It leaned precariously to one side, propped up against a neighbor's concrete wall, looking as though it might collapse if a strong typhoon wind pushed it too hard. Inside, the heat was stifling, trapped by the low ceiling. Mateo's mother, Maria, crouched over a blackened stove in the corner. Her frame was frail, her hair tied back in a messy bun, and though she was only in her mid-30s, the harsh life in the slums had aged her prematurely, carving deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She was fanning the fading coals with a piece of folded cardboard. A heavily dented aluminum pot of water rested on the grate, beginning to boil gently. She looked up as Mateo slipped through the doorway, her worried expression instantly relaxing. "You're back. You found something?" she asked, her voice raspy from the constant smoke in the air. Mateo held up the bag. "Chicken. Found it fresh." Her face softened into a small, tired smile. "That's good, Anak. Very good." Mateo poured the scavenged scraps into a shallow metal basin. Maria took over with practiced precision. She rinsed the pieces carefully under a slow trickle of precious clean water from a plastic jug. Her rough hands scrubbed off the surface dirt, the grease, and the ash, before dropping the meat into the boiling water. This was the most critical step. Overboil it, and the meat would disintegrate into mush. Underboil it, and the bacteria from the dumpsite would send them to the hospital, a place they couldn't afford to go. Slowly, the lingering, sickly smell of the garbage faded from the small shack. Maria drained the water, then slid a wok over the burning coals, tossing in cheap oil, a handful of crushed garlic, and a heavy splash of dark soy sauce. As the chicken hit the hot oil, it hissed violently, and soon, the room smelled like genuine, delicious fried chicken again. Pag Pag was a dish born of desperation, but it always required patience and care. Boil the poison out. Clean it down to the bone. Fry it again with whatever spices you could scrape together. Make it safe enough to consume. While she cooked, Mateo sat on the uneven dirt floor, leaning his tired back against the splintered wooden wall. Through the wide gaps in the planks, he could see fragments of the alley outside. He watched half-naked kids chasing a deflated basketball. He saw a group of shirtless men sitting on upturned crates, drinking cheap gin and laughing raucously even though it was barely noon. From 2 doors down, the shrill voice of a woman cut through the noise, arguing violently with a neighbor over a borrowed 50 pesos. They were just the normal, everyday sounds of Tondo. A symphony of survival. Maria handed him a cracked plastic plate, spooning a modest mound of white rice next to the dark, glistening pieces of refried chicken. She sat beside him, taking a much smaller portion for herself. "You did well today, Mateo," she murmured, eating a small piece of rice. Mateo shrugged, unable to feel the pride. "I had more. June and the Askals stopped me at the bottom of the hill. They took the best pieces." Maria paused, her spoon hovering in the air. A flash of sorrow passed through her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by weary acceptance. She nodded slowly. "That's how it is, Mateo. We don't anger the dogs. We just survive them." For a long while, they ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of spoons against plastic. The chicken was tough, overcooked from its double frying, but the heavy garlic and soy sauce made it flavorful. It was warm. It filled the empty, aching void in his stomach. For today, that was enough. After the meal, Mateo stepped back outside into the blinding midday glare. The neighborhood was now roaring with chaotic, vibrant activity. Motorized tricycles rattled loudly through the narrow, potholed roads, their drivers shouting for pedestrians to move. Vendors pushed heavy wooden carts through the throng, selling deep-fried fish balls on skewers and sweet, caramel-coated grilled bananas. From open, screenless windows, distorted radios blasted soaring, dramatic old Filipino love songs, blending into a wall of unrelenting noise. And underneath it all, the inescapable smells. The rotting garbage. The acrid exhaust smoke. And, faintly beneath it, the salty, contaminated breeze drifting inward from the dark waters of Manila Bay. With nothing left to scavenge until the evening trucks arrived, Mateo decided to take a walk, heading past his alley toward the community basketball court. The court was little more than a patch of cracked, weed-choked concrete with faded painted lines, surrounded by rusting chain-link fences. But despite its condition, it was the social heart of the neighborhood. It was also the undisputed headquarters of the Askals. When Mateo arrived, lingering near the perimeter fence, he saw them immediately. June was leaning casually against the metal pole of the basketball hoop, smoking a cigarette, while the boy with the scar lazily tossed a deflated basketball toward the rusted rim. It clanged off the iron and rolled away. June spotted Mateo standing by the fence. He exhaled a long plume of smoke and smirked. "Hey, Pag King." June called out loudly, making sure the people passing by could hear. "You still hungry? We have chicken bones if you want them." The other gang members erupted into crude laughter. Mateo felt his face flush hot with humiliation. He kept his head down and started walking away, intending to circle the block and head to the docks. He didn't want trouble. But, June's tone shifted. The mocking edge vanished, replaced by something sharper. Something serious. "Hey. Wait. Come here." Mateo stopped in his tracks. He turned slowly, eyeing the gang with deep suspicion. June flicked his cigarette away and walked over to the fence, studying Mateo the way a merchant evaluates livestock. He looked up and down at Mateo's small frame, his thin arms, and his intensely observant eyes. "You're tired of eating trash, aren't you?" June asked quietly. Mateo looked at the backpack. He didn't see drugs. He saw rice. Medicine for his mother. A roof that didn't leak when the rain came. Mateo said nothing. The answer was obvious. June leaned closer to the chain-link fence. "You want to make real money?" That single question had the power to change everything. It was the question that lured thousands of boys like Mateo into the underworld every single year. Mateo stepped a few inches closer, his caution warring with his desperate curiosity. "What kind of money? Doing what?" June glanced left and right, making sure no adults or community watchmen were paying them any attention, before lowering his voice to a hushed murmur. "Delivery." Mateo frowned, his guard instantly coming up. "Delivery of what?" June narrowed his eyes, his gaze steady and calculating. "Things that important people pay very good money for." He nodded at the boy chewing the sugarcane. The boy unzipped a black nylon backpack just a few inches, revealing the contents. Tucked inside amidst crumpled clothes were dozens of tiny, tightly sealed plastic sachets containing a translucent, crystalline substance. Mateo knew exactly what it was immediately. Everyone in Tondo did. Shabu. Crystal meth. The white devil that ruined families, fueled the violence in the streets, and brought the armed police raiding into the slums in the dead of night. June saw the flash of recognition and fear in Mateo's eyes. "Relax," June whispered reassuringly, gripping the fence. "You're not selling it. You're not smoking it. You just take a package, walk from point A to point B, hand it to a guy, and walk back. That's it. You're basically a postman." Mateo hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the immense risks. If the police caught him, he would be thrown into a brutally overcrowded youth detention center, or worse, he might end up as a bloody corpse in a dark alley, a victim of the drug war. If another gang intercepted him, they might kill him just for the product. But as he looked at the drugs, he also understood a heartbreaking truth. Scavenging Pag would keep him and his mother alive for another day, but it would never, ever get them out of Tondo. It was a cycle of eternal poverty. June reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, blue 1,000 peso bill. He held it up to the chain-link fence, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. You deliver one package, you get this. Guaranteed. No cuts. No taxes. Mateo stared at the blue bill. The faces of the three martyrs on the currency seemed to stare right back at him. 1,000 pesos. It was a staggering, reality-altering sum for a boy who had nothing. It was more than he sometimes earned in 3 grueling, back-breaking days of scavenging in the blistering heat. It meant fresh rice. It meant real, clean meat that didn't come from a garbage truck. June leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. You're small. You're quiet. The police don't look twice at invisible street kids like you. You walk right past them, and they just see the dirt. It's perfect. The other boys nodded in rough agreement. Mateo felt the immense weight of the moment pressing down on his chest, suffocating him more than the smog. Opportunity. That was what the men in the streets called it. But opportunity in the slums always came wrapped tightly in extreme danger. He thought of his mother, coughing over the charcoal stove. He thought of the taste of garbage in his throat at dawn. He took a long, remarkably steady breath, staring June directly in the eyes. Where do I go? Mateo asked. June nodded slowly, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. Good answer, kid. Very good answer. The first delivery was simple. Almost simple. June handed him a small, dense packet wrapped tightly in clear plastic and sealed with layers of black electrical tape. It was no larger than a matchbox, but as Mateo tucked it into the waistband of his oversized shorts, it felt as heavy as a cinderblock against his skin. You walk straight to the Sari Sari store on Delgado Street, June instructed, his eyes serious as he mapped out the route mentally. Don't look at anyone. Don't run. Running makes you look guilty. You find a guy wearing a bright blue baseball cap. You hand him the package. He gives you a folded white envelope. You bring that envelope right back to me. Understood? Mateo nodded sharply. Understood. He turned and began the walk. The journey to Delgado Street was only 6 blocks, a route Mateo had run 1,000 times while playing or scavenging, but today, every step felt excruciatingly long. The oppressive heat seemed to amplify his anxiety. His heart hammered a frantic, unsteady rhythm against his ribs. The neighborhood felt different. Every passing motorcycle sounded like the roar of a police siren, making his stomach clench and acid rise in his throat. Every vendor or loiterer he passed seemed to be staring at his waistline for a second too long, as if they possessed X-ray vision and could see the illegal narcotics pressing against his hip. Up ahead, a pair of uniformed police officers were casually buying sodas from a street stall. Mateo's breath hitched. His instinct screamed at him to turn around and sprint back to the basketball court. Don't run, June's voice echoed in his head. They just see the dirt. Mateo swallowed hard, lowered his eyes, and kept his walking pace absolutely steady. He slouched his shoulders, making himself look as small and pathetic as possible. He walked right past the armed officers. They didn't even glance in his direction. To them, he was exactly what June had said, just another invisible, filthy street rat. Relief washed over him in a dizzying wave as he rounded the corner onto Delgado Street. The Sari Sari store was a small wooden shack protected by rusted wire mesh, selling everything from individual cigarettes to small sachets of shampoo. Leaning against the wooden counter, drinking a soda from a glass bottle, was a heavy-set man wearing a bright blue baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Mateo approached the stall quietly. He didn't say a word until he was standing directly beside the man. You June's boy? The man asked in a low, gravelly voice, not bothering to look down at him. Mateo nodded once. With lightning speed, the man held his hand low by his side. Mateo slipped the taped packet from his waistband and pressed it swiftly into the man's large palm. The man pocketed it in a single, fluid motion. Without another word, the man retrieved a thick, folded white envelope from his back pocket and slipped it into Mateo's hands. "Now get out of here," the man muttered, taking another slow sip of his soda. Mateo turned around and walked away, his legs shaking slightly with adrenaline. Simple. It was horrifyingly simple. When he finally returned to the safety of the cracked basketball court, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows over the slums. June was still waiting by the fence. He took the white envelope from Mateo, tore it open, and quickly counted the stack of large bills inside, a look of deep satisfaction crossing his scarred face. June nodded in approval. He pulled a single, crisp 1,000 peso bill from his own pocket and held it out. Mateo took it cautiously. He stared at the blue bill resting on his dirt-stained palm. It felt surreal. He had crossed an invisible, permanent line today, and the reward was sitting right there in his hand. It was an amount of money that could buy them a sack of clean rice, fresh vegetables, and real meat. No more searching through rotting trash. No more pag. June clapped a heavy hand on Mateo's shoulder, pulling him from his thoughts. "See? I told you it was easy. You did good, kid. Come back tomorrow afternoon. There's plenty more where that came from." That was the exact day 13-year-old Mateo Reyes abandoned his innocence and permanently entered the business of the streets. Later that humid night, long after his mother had gone to sleep, Mateo walked through the pitch-black neighborhood alone. The alleys were the same. The fragile, leaning houses were the same. The overpowering smell of garbage and smoke had not changed. But everything within Mateo felt different. He felt dirty in a way that soap and water couldn't wash off. He had helped poison his own streets today. He had carried a package of destruction that would ruin someone's fragile life. A nauseating knot of guilt twisted in his stomach. "But you have 1,000 pesos, a desperate voice whispered in his mind, aggressively fighting the guilt. "You can buy clean rice. Your mother won't starve tonight. You did what you had to do." He reached into his pocket, his small, calloused fingers tracing the stiff edges of the bill. It was the hardest money he had ever made, not because of the physical labor, but because of the moral weight. The guilt was heavy, but the desperate instinct to survive was heavier, he realized. His wandering feet carried him to the edge of the neighborhood, right to the dump site. Under the pale glow of the moonlight, the gargantuan trash mountain looked almost peaceful, a silent monument to the city's waste. At the base, a group of emaciated young kids were beginning their climb, carrying empty rice sacks over their shoulders to begin the night shift of scavenging. Just like he used to do. Just hours ago. Mateo stood there in the shadows for a long moment, watching them suffer. He remembered the metallic, sour taste of pag on his tongue. He remembered the profound, crushing shame of having his hard-earned scraps stolen by bullies. He remembered the relentless, burning hunger that kept him awake at night. All of those feelings still lived somewhere deep inside him, a permanent scar on his soul. But they were no longer in control. Now, he possessed a new feeling. A new weapon. Opportunity. He turned away from the mountain of trash and looked out across the water. Far above the squalor of the Tondo slums, the neon-lit skyscrapers of the financial district glittered against the night sky like a separate, untouchable universe. The towers represented a world of impossible wealth, power, and security. Mateo stood still, staring fiercely at the shimmering skyline. One day, he promised himself in the darkness, he would live there. He wouldn't just survive, he would conquer. He would never live in garbage again. He would never be at the bottom of the ladder, scrounging for leftovers while men like June threw him crumbs. He would rise up and take his place in the glass towers where the truly powerful lived and ruled. He didn't know exactly how he would get there yet. But as his fingers brushed the crisp edge of the folded money in his pocket, he knew with certainty that his path was finally set. The streets had just shown him how the game was played, and he was a very fast learner. He was done searching through the trash.